Welcome to the next episode of Catalyzing Radical Systemic Change, where it's all about discovering, mapping, and cross-pollinating what I think are the necessary ingredients towards a planetary civilization ahead. Today's topic is Iboga in the broadest sense, and I feel very fortunate, actually very humble and grateful that I had two very deep encounters with this sacred medicine in my own life. And today's guest is Tobias Erny. He's a renowned expert in the field of Iboga. And my first question for you today, Toby, is imagine somebody never heard about Iboga. If you were to take a sketch of this like rich tapestry that we're going to unfold in the podcast, what would be your first metaphor to introduce Iboga?
So Iboga could be seen as kind of a herbal leatherman or phytotherapeutic multi-tool, because there are numerous of indications for taking it, and it has a pretty wide spectrum for applications. For example, traditionally in Africa, it is used as medicine, as stimulant, as aphrodisiac, and also as herbal invigorating tonic. And most importantly, to some, it's a catalyst for spiritual initiations. So, for example, they take in Africa low doses for hunting to sharpen the senses and to heighten the intuition. And they can go hunting for days without eating too much because it's quite stimulating, and their success on hunts gets better. But also it is, for example, used for toothache. So if people have toothache, they chew on the root bark and it numbs the mouth a bit. And generally it is said to have a very energizing and vitalizing qualities, which is absolutely not only bushman mumbo jumbo, but there are some pharmacological backgrounds to this. And in the modern Western world, it is used as a super powerful tool to treat addictions or other psychological disorders. And we're currently exploring it as possible aid for Parkinson's disease. So it has also applications in the neurodegenerative disease sector. Now it's a super broad spectrum that's there with Iboga.
Let's make this a little bit personal. So one of the traits in my podcast is that I don't leave the human being out. So Tobias Erny makes the experience as a human being. What made you discover Iboga, and what was your personal experience with working with that holy plant?
So in beginning of the millennium, in 2000s, I was working in the chemical pharmaceutical industry in Basel, Switzerland, and had quite good access to all kinds of different substances. And I also got hooked on not so nice substances, namely heroin or opiates, also synthetic opiates. And I was looking for a way out of the addiction, and the addiction was just kind of a symptom. There were deeper layers of this malady or of this sickness. And being in this kind of psychedelic world, I read a lot of all kinds of substances, and I stumbled across Iboga. And then in 2006, I took Iboga, and it basically opened me up totally to a spiritual world that I didn't knew that existed in this way. I read about these other worlds, but I was very rational, very pragmatic, deterministic. What is not measurable is not there. And Iboga, besides healing my addiction, showed me that there are multi-layers of dimensions that we in normal common consciousness are not able to access, but they are there. And with the Iboga, I was able to dive pretty deep into my own subconsciousness, but also into my biographic, into my history, and see what were the causalities, what were the karmic points, what were the key positions in my life that actually led to the addiction being just a symptom. So it was not a symptomatic cure, but it led me right to the core of my issues that were underlying my addiction and other sicknesses. And so I could work on this core of the problems, which led to subsequently a very how to say, more healthy, more aware lifestyle. I started with meditation. I got more compassion. My pretty narrow view of being pretty egoistic opened up, and I got more aware of how my actions also affect others and not just myself. So it basically made me a much more aware person. Yeah.
I would like to open a couple of separate drawers and then trust the space in between the two of us that we riff off spontaneously. One thing that I'm well aware of is that Iboga in the Western world is especially used for addiction treatment. So that's definitely one drawer that I want to open up. And it feels like the most natural segue, since for whatever reason, it also helped you cure your own addiction. So when you see Iboga as a cultural phenomenon coming to the West, I wonder if you could sketch a little bit the market and what actually happens in addiction treatment with Iboga.
So addiction, especially in the United States, is nowadays an epidemic. There is an opioid epidemic. I think 2017 was the first year that more people died of opiate overdoses than through gunshots and car accidents together in the United States. So it was the #1 death case in the demography from 18 to 50 years old. So there is a huge epidemic of addiction, especially opiate addiction in the United States, but in general, addictions or psychological disorders are skyrocketing, even more amplified by the COVID-19 or Corona thing. So there is a huge demand for psychological aids, for treatment modalities for psychological disorders. And currently the market for ibogaine or iboga is quite a wild west, I would say. Some people say it's a huge uncontrolled medical experiment because it's scheduled in the United States. Luckily, there are some countries where it's not scheduled, and there are certain clinics who work with it on a quite high standard. But a lot of people also just try to use it for themselves and try to get out of their problems. So we try nowadays to kind of set a certain standard and help people. There are studies being conducted. But the general thing with Iboga is that at the beginning of the Iboga treatment in the West, there was this myth kind of, you take one Iboga and you're healed. And that's not the case. You kind of need to embed the whole experience with proper preparation, then the Iboga intervention, but subsequently also a good integrative care and post-integrative practice with psychotherapists. So there are now being developed quite different protocols, which all seem to help much better than any other opiate treatments.
Let's stay in the realm of the applications for a moment. So you said almost like a leather tool. It has multiple applications. So where do you see it being adopted besides for addiction treatment in the West?
So right now, we do research for Parkinson's disease. There is this neuropharmacological property of Iboga that makes dopamine neurons to sprout. Basically, it stimulates the growth and promotes the survival of dopamine neurons. So there are Parkinson's disease, for example, which is a neurodegenerative disease where the dopamine neurons degenerate. And for addiction, quite interesting, the rewardment system, which is basically destroyed by negative drugs, also consists of dopamine neurons. So there's this addiction healing option. There is the option for treating Parkinson's disease and alleviates the Parkinson's disease symptoms. But also we treat persons who are terminally ill. This is a total new field of research because Ibogaine or Iboga lower the opiate tolerance, and people who are terminally ill, who have enormous pain, take a lot of high dose of opiates, and sometimes these opiates don't work anymore because they just take every day super high doses of it. So with right now, there's a new field of research emerging where they give small doses of Iboga, which leads to a much lower tolerance of the opiates. And so we can basically make the last few days or weeks of a terminally ill patient much more pleasant because the opiates work again. And also, it has a certain psycho-spiritual aspect to it. So not just for addiction, but also for people who have trauma. It is researched for veterans who have war trauma, absolutely not connected to any kind of addiction, but very deep-rooted psychological traumatic experiences. We have people who treat their depressions with it. We have people who treat their eating disorders with it, because the interesting thing about Iboga, it has on one side this neuropharmacological way of working, but then on the other side, there is this spiritual experience, kind of a psycho-spiritual journey. High doses of Iboga, you go to kind of a near-death experience where people say they see their life flashing before their eyes, or they kind of go into other worlds, they say, and the astral body detaches from the physical body. And when they come back, they often have insights into the key elements of their life, why certain things are the way they are. And also, Iboga has kind of an, I would say, dissociative aspect. So having this experience, you can analyze your own character in a very distinct way without being emotionally too involved in it. So you kind of have an analytical approach to yourself, or possibly you can have. Not everybody has this.
After having sketched all the possible applications, I'm curious now to dive into the felt experience. So I feel like I can also share something of my experiences, but I know you're way more experienced, and also you have seen people experiencing like low to medium to high doses of Iboga. How about you start? I mean,
I would be super interested in your experience, because you never told me in that detail about your experience. Do you want to start with your experience and then we go into my experience?
Yeah, sure, we can do that.
Cool.
So just as a frame of reference to those listening, because I did record a quite lengthy podcast in German only with Alexander Faubel around that. So I will try to make it brief, but it might take nevertheless like 3 to 5 minutes. So the frame of reference for me is that I did take Iboga twice during a shamanic training, and after already having done some maybe 80 ayahuasca journeys, certainly a plethora of other psychedelic experiences, from Peyote, San Pedro, mushrooms to LSD. I think that was it. So I felt like really experienced. And the first time I took Iboga, it was almost like as if a room behind thoughts, emotions. So in Tibetan language, I would call it like the causal void opened. So almost like the room behind me perceiving reality, the causal void, which felt actually for me very comfortable. And it was almost like, it was very clear and structured. And in the second encounter, which by the way, I took a very low dose because I had the feeling I don't need such a strong intervention. It was the end of the shamanic training. So we were taking this as capsules, but the full alkaloid spectrum, so the full plant, not synthesized. And I only did take 2 capsules. And some were taking 4, some were taking 6 or 8. So I was really on the lower ends of, let's say, the dosage. And what happened again was like kind of this like causal void opening and pulling me into it. It felt like falling into emptiness, void, space, nothingness. And then what happened, which for me was a tremendously freeing experience, the Eye of Horus was showing up. I never experienced this, but it seems to be a very archetypal, you know, kind of this one Eye of Horus in front of me. And it was again like this guardian angel of physical mortality showing up in my life. And for the first time ever, after 11 years of doing psychedelic work, I had the feeling I could dive through that portal without fear, you know, instead of, you know, putting myself out there and saying, okay, I face death, you know. I had more this like, I was like swimming through it. And then the rest of the experience for me in my personal life was the most intense, but at the same time deepest, richest, and most natural. I would call it samadhi. So it was like a constant state of bliss for like many hours, like 6 hours or so. And also just to frame that experience, I also have a background with addiction. Mine was mainly alcohol and cigarettes and marijuana, which I quit years ago. And so for me in that space, I had the feeling I've done my homework. So there was like no additional homework, you know, I was not given lists of bullet points, what me as Alistair I still have to do. It was really just having this like enormously freeing, samadhi. So samadhi experience, not in the sense of a super high dose psychedelic experience, but more really with my eyes open or with my eyes closed, just being immersed into bliss, ecstasy, beingness, and an utter feeling of being in the moment. So that might not at all be representative, but since you asked me, you know, to give my experience, that was my encounter with Iboga some 6 to 8 weeks back or so. And I feel they say it takes a year, you know, for the whole system to integrate. I feel like for the first time in my life, I'm still pretty hyperactive. You know, I have a lot of energy moving through my body, although now being in my 40s, I'm 42. But it gave me a certain ease that I can almost sense physically, which I think I've always been searching for. And I think it's one of the biggest gifts that I have received in this lifetime, definitely.
They say it provokes the stillness or the emptiness. So once you work through a lot of these personal energetic knots, when you went through this, basically Iboga puts you into a quite stillness, emptiness, which is massively peaceful.
I'm now trying to sense into not what is of worth in terms of product service, but when you were to like contrast maybe your own experiences, because I know you're vastly more
Absolutely.
experienced with the
Yes.
substance. So curious to listen into your own experiences, but maybe also sketching examples of other people you know that did work with Iboga.
So Iboga for me is like a gateway to the energetic hyperdimensional realms as well as to the subconsciousness. So I had an Iboga experience, which was my third Iboga very high dosed experience, where I took the root, the total plant. My first two experiences were with pure ibogaine hydrochloride, which were there, the gates were open. I went to these other worlds, but I didn't have this guide. And then my third experience, I took the full route, not even extraction, so munching a lot of wood chips. And there like a entity, a being beamed right in front of me. I was lying in bed and it just appeared, and it was for me physically tangible. It was there, like you are there if you are in a room with me. So I was pretty like, oh gosh, what's this? I never had this contact with an hyperdimensional entity, which I visually perceive so clear before in my life. And then I looked down at my body and I saw all these energetic, like nadis, they call it in the yogic literature, or energy channels, where the Chinese people would say the qi flows and they put the acupuncture needles. And I saw all my body with all the whole energetic system. And I saw in one specific point knots. And I had also quite some pain in this body part. And this entity was there and telepathically communicated to me, hey, I'm there to help you. Don't be afraid. Because the moment it appeared in front of me, I was like, oh, wow, what's this? And so this being somewhat conveyed or telepathically communicated to me that it's there since eons, like thousands and thousands and thousands of years, having this one consciousness stream, consecutive consciousness stream, and is there to help me and wants to heal me. And it came closer to me and I got a bit scared, and it put its hands and went right into my body. So basically its hands really went inside of my body. And the moment it touched me, I felt this really, really beautiful, loving energy. And it kind of untied these energetic knots that I saw in my energy system. And while it was untying these energetic knots, I started somehow to understand, or telepathically it was communicated to me, where these knots came from and what are these entanglements, karmically speaking, what led to these knots. So this was a massively impressive experience, because having had the pure ibogaine hydrochloride experiences before, which led actually to me not taking opiates anymore, but somehow not on this depth, not this level of profundity I only had when I had this contact to this plant entity. A funny thing, before I read about certain plant entities, but I was always a bit like, yeah, let those hippies talk. And having this first-hand experience, it just blew my mind and got me super interested in this. So I kind of established a relationship with this entity. I would call it an ally. It's and you know, like a friendship with you or with other persons. The more you talk with someone, the better you get to know someone, and there is this mutual appreciation that's deepened over time. So this is my third Iboga experience with the wood chips, with the root bark. And you also ask for other experiences. So one experience now pops into my mind that was showing me very clearly how Iboga kind of x-rays your mind and takes all the garbage out that there is. So there was a medical doctor who wanted to work with Iboga and who wanted to experience it himself before. And we generally tell people, if you do an Iboga experience, general psychedelic experience, try to keep a certain psychological hygiene, not just physical hygiene, but also keep your mind somewhat clean. When he arrived, he told me how it was at the time where there was Trump and North Korea things going on. And he told me how he basically, the last few days, was always reading about nuclear weapons and following in the media all these things. And after the experience, he told me how the first 3-4 hours of the experience were only visions of nuclear war and detonations of nuclear things. And after that, he went into a bit more into his biographical things, but he didn't reach a full depth. And I really think Iboga kind of showed him, look, you put all this garbage in your mind, and now I show you what is in your subconsciousness if you don't take good care of your subconsciousness. So this was pretty clear to me. And he also afterwards said, wow, I didn't expect this, and maybe I should take more care about what I eat, psychologically speaking.
Since both our own stories and the third one you mentioned are, eclectic, I wonder what medical literature tells about that. So I imagine, I know ibogaine is one of the compounds that's not as heavily studied as other ones, such as psilocybin or MDMA, but I know there is a library of studies done with Iboga. So I wonder if are there like discerning factors where you say, okay, like low dosage generally does these, unlocks these couple of experiences, middle dosage these couple of experiences, high dosage these couple of experiences. So to educate the listener on what to expect, I really think any psychedelic experience is always incredibly unique. But are there some common features that you could outline for like low, medium, and high dosages from literature?
There are some, but Iboga, being a very unique molecule, has this feature of being massively unpredictable if you don't know your body very well. There are certain liver enzymes that metabolize ibogaine or Iboga to noribogaine, and depending on your genetic phenotype, you might have these liver enzymes very high expressed or low expressed or as good as not expressed. And so there is this, if you don't know your body very well, it's hard to predict. But generally, low doses stimulate, heighten your awareness, and are set to give a certain introspection without having a full psychedelic experience. So it's more of a stimulant than a psychedelic in lower doses. If you go slightly higher, the psychedelic experience takes over, and your thoughts start to be guided in certain directions. And if you go for a full experience, it can be a several day lasting near-death experience. So this near-death experience also in literature have a pretty broad variety, depending a lot on your psychological constitution, your personal history, also your worldview. But generally said, small doses or microdoses are easy for basically everyone to deal with, since it's making you a bit more awake. People feel more grounded. But the moment you get over a certain dose, the psychedelic realm opens up, and to predict from there on is pretty hard without doing a personal assessment. When you get to know a person and you talk with them, where they're from, what are the issues, and so on, you can somewhat give a direction or predict the direction. But just very generally speaking, from higher doses, it's not so easy to predict.
So let's move more towards, let's say, the policy and advocacy and market shaping element of our dialogue today. So sure. You mentioned it's pretty much like Wild West, you know, and I'm curious to listen in to the endeavors that you want to foster through the Global Iboga Therapy Alliance. Mm-hmm. And I just want to read the Global Iboga Therapy Alliance wants to promote and foster spiritual awareness and make Iboga accepted on a broader scale. So where is this endeavor standing, and what are the milestones that you see in the years ahead?
Okay, so basically GITA, or the Global Iboga Therapy Alliance, was founded by Horvath Lotzov, who was the first Westerner to report the opiate addiction interruption qualities. And basically, GITA is there to support the development of research and clinical trials in order to expand the evidence-based knowledge. And also, we explore these novel therapeutic potentials of Iboga. For this, we have quite some research going on right now. We have some clinics in Mexico, in Costa Rica, and there is now in London with Imperial College research conducted. So basically, the next milestones will be official state licensed clinic, which a friend of me is just right now opening up, and with maps in the background and state approval. Another thing is our Parkinson's trials. We made the preclinical case reports on treating Parkinson's with low doses, so not near-death experiences, but very low doses. And we have massive success with alleviating the symptoms of Parkinson's. So basically, the next stepping stone will be a clinical trial for the Parkinson's disease lineage of research. And then also what GITA does is it's basically a peer support from providers for providers. So we want to establish a certain standard of working, because in a wild west, everybody does what they want to do, and this sometimes results in not so good there are sometimes even death cases if people don't know what they are doing. They are you can kind of rule them out if you know what you're doing. So we start to establish certain standards and certain rules of how to work with Iboga. And yeah, basically the next stepping stones are how to integrate it in a medically approved setting for Westerners who want to heal with it, and also to make researchers, professors, addiction specialists, Parkinson neurologists more aware of this treatment modality, because it's pretty unknown in the broader sense. In the psychedelic world, people have known or heard of it, but in the broader common Western medical world, it's not very known. And we have this research that really points in the direction that this is a massive potential slumbering there.
So in between a massive potential slumbering, you were nevertheless mentioning one key aspect that might happen, which is, by the way, to my humble knowledge, totally unique to Iboga, so that if not applied under the right circumstances and given the right protocol, there is the possibility for people to die from heart failure. So obviously, dear listeners, yes, you should not die if you try it, right? So this is like a huge red flag, obviously. So this has to do to my like layman understanding with the protocol that needs to be applied. So Toby, since you will take an official position of a heading, you know, the Global Iboga Therapy Alliance, I think it should be in your own enlightened self-interest, you know, a high priority to not get cases of people dying while we're trying to foster and promote, you know, the you know the various applications of Iboga. So please, you know, yeah, tell us what we can do to make things right.
So basically, if you take a very high dose of Iboga, it prolongs what is called the QT interval. Basically, slows down the heartbeat. And there are certain pre-existing heart conditions which are an absolute exclusion criteria. So if you have a tachycardia or bradycardia, or if you have arrhythmias in your heart, or if you have a prolonged QT, then you're not good to take high doses of Iboga. And there are people who just take it without knowing. You can have these heart conditions 40, 50 years without even knowing about them. And then you take a very high dose of Iboga and your heart stops beating or starts getting arrhythmias. And if then the provider is not prepared for this, meaning having an AED, an automatic electric defibrillator on site, this might be your last, or not a near death, but a death experience. And so what is one of the minimum criteria for a good provider is, if they provide higher doses, is to ask for an ECG beforehand, read by an cardiologist or heart specialist, to rule out certain heart conditions. So this is minimum standard.
Are there any other contra indications specifically for Iboga? Because I don't want to riff off and open a whole rabbit hole for, you know, how to prepare for psychedelic experiences and stuff like that. And I reckon this would be a question into your direction. I mean, to my knowledge, most Western applications don't work with like high dosages, right? It's like medium to mid dosages, right?
There are clinics who work with pretty high doses. And if these clinics have somewhat of a minimum ethical standard, they do these ECGs. There are clinics where are doctors on site, where there are nurses on site, and these registered nurses and doctors know what to do in case of an emergency. So there are clinics who work in an ethical, good way, and there are some clandestine anarcho-punk people who mean good, but basically also play with their lives. Besides the heart conditions, there are certain things. So it's a bit of a schism between the Western world and the African world, because in Africa, having schizophrenia, for example, is an indication for the need to take Iboga. So if in Africa someone is schizophrenic and has a psychological disorder in this direction, they say you must take Iboga to explore and to see what is the reason for it in the spiritual worlds. And in the Western world, they say actually schizophrenia is an exclusion criteria. So there is a bit of this schism between the shamanistic worldview of being able to treat this and the Western clinical approach, where they say, no, you cannot take a psychedelic if you have schizophrenia. Also, I think if the people are not really good in what they are doing, you should not take Iboga when you have schizophrenia. In Africa, there's a whole village, that the whole cultural context is kind of there to hold such experiences. So in a Western world, I also think things like this are more of an exclusion criteria. But in a context where the whole culture evolves around the use of this substance, it could not, or it is not an exclusion criteria.
So I don't want to tokenize indigenous cultures, but I know you're one of the very few people that I know that has been to Gabon. So could you sketch not only your immersing yourself in the culture and experiencing the culture, but also maybe a couple of traits? So I feel more like listening in and offering the people like a picture or a story or a song almost. Like, how do I imagine a culture? They call it the Bwiti Cult or cult. So how do I imagine these people that are basically having this deep psychedelic near-death experience at the core, at the epicenter of their culture? Super curious to listen in.
So basically, their culture is very animistic, very spiritual, charged. So for them, everything that happens when they walk through the forest is a sign and a signal. When I was there and I was preparing for initiation, there was a beetle coming, like a Scarabaeus beetle, coming and flying around me, making a circle and flying away. And for me, it was an insect flying around, but they were like, "Wow, that's a sign. You are now ready. The beetle invites you in the spiritual world and opens up the portal for you." So we started then dosing. So they're very connected to all these little signs and signal that nature gives them. And also the spirituality there, it's for them healing, spirituality, and the community are not to be separated from each other. There is, let's say in Western world, you're diagnosed with liver cancer. So there is the liver cancer being treated in the liver with whatever chemo or radiation therapy or something like this. In Bwiti culture, they take Iboga and they take a look at you in the bigger spiritual context. How is your relation to your relatives? How is your position in the village? Are there possibly dead relatives that you upset with something, or are there angry nature spirits? So they have kind of an holistic way of looking at sicknesses and also a holistic way of treating these sicknesses. It's very hard to bring this Western world with this shamanic animistic world together, because both worlds, the one is quite arrogant and the other things, it's hard to bring these worlds together. But it's super interesting to see how I personally have several people in my friend circle who were set death by Western medicine. Like a friend of me was told, you're gonna live 3 more months, we can do nothing for you, and he was in a wheelchair. And he went into plant medicine and he basically had a spontaneous remission, which the doctors till now cannot really tell what happened. They say this is impossible, what's happening here. But he says because of his deep dive into the spiritual world, he could see how he was living a lie and how he was kind of betraying his own inner wishes by certain things he did. And the moment he realized that his body was basically screaming, don't live this way anymore, he was forced to change his lifestyle spiritually through his insight, and now lives a good life again, while the doctors say it's impossible that you walk around here.
I would like you to sketch a little bit the itchy, difficult parts. So now that Iboga gets more wildly spread, there's obviously also more, demand for Iboga, and there are more Westerners coming to Gabon, which is both, it's both good and bad, so I want to leave out the good and bad. But where do you see, is because Gabon is such a small, super, I mean, I think one of really the few remaining, you know, African states that are like super original in that sense, and they have preserved a lot of their culture. Where do you see the whole endeavor standing at the moment? And then also, what do you think, what measures need to be taken so that ultimately the people are not just deprived of their sacred testament, and again, it being, you know, commodified and extracted from the culture?
So actually, I know different tribes down there, and I'm in contact with different villages. And what helps them actually is that Westerners show appreciation for their cultural heritage, because basically the problem is that all these little villages, the young people want to go into city and to get a Western lifestyle, to have a Mercedes-Benz, to live whatever they see in TV from the Western world, and forget about their cultural heritage with this. And now us Westerners coming there and appreciating actually their cultural heritage makes them quite proud, what I've seen. So there are people who are really happy and moved, and the youngsters there, that if they see us Westerners coming there and appreciating the culture and their knowledge about the forest, about all the plant medicines and such, they are then more stimulated to not give up all this for a Western lifestyle, but they see how what kind of riches they have there on for themselves. So it's always a bit a problem of this cultural appropriation or spiritual leaching out of things. So I think that there are several projects where you can go to Africa, where you can support the culture there. The Africans that I have spoken to actually say, we have here our culture and we are very happy to share this, but don't just take it and copy paste it into Western culture, because it just doesn't fit there. So even the African shamans that I talked to and that I heard speaking said, we as Westerners, if we use Iboga or Ibogaine, should develop our own personal style about this, and not just do a copy and paste thing.
Maybe towards the end of our encounter today, we don't know the future, right? We can't look into a crystal ball and say, oh, this is 5 years or 10 years or 30 years in the future. I believe that we create the future. We actually co-create the future. So let's leave the doomsday scenario, everything collapsing out for a moment, because I know and think and feel we all pretty much agree on all the challenges. If you take a daringly bold, positive outlook into the future of humanity in the next decades ahead, and you think of the role that Iboga could play on that, what would that look like?
So basically, I would envision a world, or I am dedicated to create and co-create a world where Iboga and the use of ibogaine thrive naturally, and where their sacramental and therapeutic potential has been explored, researched, and shared, so that it's safely and affordably available for everyone in need of it. And what's the quite positive thing of this awareness that Iboga promotes in people is this connection to nature, is this connection to that we, or the insight that we are all interconnected, not just the humans, but all species or the biosphere. I know people, for example, who were working in Gabon. There are some oil fields in front in the ocean of Western Africa. And they were working on the oil fields as divers, and just went some holidays to the mainland of Gabon, and somehow stumbled across Iboga, taking Iboga, and were somehow realizing that they are involved in not so nice things and totally changed their lifestyle. So I envision a world where Iboga helps people to realize that we are interspecies-wise connected to everybody and everything here on this planet. And if we fuck up for a tiny part, we fuck up for all of us. And if we do good for a tiny part, we could also do good for all of us.
Thanks so much, Toby, for the session today.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, Toby.
Yeah.